Why you feel attracted to someone. The secret Bert Hellinger revealed about attraction will disturb you. Have you ever fallen for someone and couldn't explain why? It wasn't just the looks, it wasn't just the way they talked, it was something deeper, an inexplicable sense of familiarity, as if you already knew that person before you ever truly met them. And sometimes after the relationship ends, especially when it ends painfully, you look back and notice a pattern, the same dynamic, the same type of person, the same emotional cycle, with different faces. You promise that this time will be different, that you've learned your lesson, that you'll choose better, and then you find yourself, months or years later, in exactly the same emotional place, with a different person. That's not coincidence. And it's not bad luck. Bert Hellinger, the German therapist who developed family constellation, had a radically different view of attraction. For him, most of what we call romantic choice is not choice. It's repetition. It's the family system operating in silence, seeking to complete what was left unfinished generations before you were born. Today we're going to explore what this method reveals about why you feel attracted to certain people. But fair warning, one of the concepts you'll encounter here may explain why certain people are impossible to forget. Stay until then. What family constellation is and why it matters here. Family constellation is a therapeutic method developed by Bert Hellinger in the 1980s and 90s, grounded in phenomenology, the observation of what emerges without prior judgment, and in family systems theory. The central premise is simple and profound. You are not just an individual. You are part of a system, a chain of people, stories, traumas, and loyalties that stretches back generations before you. And that system operates in you in ways the conscious mind rarely perceives. For family constellation, the family functions like a field. Each member has a place in that field. When someone is excluded, forgotten, or unacknowledged, a child who died young, a rejected relative, an unprocessed trauma, the system seeks to restore balance. And it's often a descendant who, without knowing it, carries that weight. This affects everything, including, and especially, who you choose to love. If, as you read this, something resonates internally, a feeling of recognition, not guilt, that's already the beginning. Family constellation doesn't ask you to understand everything at once. It only asks you to look. But how exactly does this show up in attraction? The answer begins with an idea most people don't want to hear. You don't choose, you repeat. This is the most uncomfortable idea in family constellation when it comes to attraction. Most people believe they fall in love freely, that attraction is chemistry, mysterious, unpredictable, that each relationship is a conscious choice based on compatibility and feeling. Hellinger would say, not exactly. What we call attraction is, in large part, recognition, not of someone new, but of something familiar. Emotional patterns you learned in childhood, dynamics you observed between your parents, ways of loving and being loved that became your internal model for relationships. You feel attracted to whoever confirms that model, not because you're a masochist, but because the nervous system recognizes the familiar as safe, even when the familiar is painful. That's why someone who grew up with an emotionally distant parent tends to be attracted to emotionally unavailable partners. Not because they want to suffer, but because emotional unavailability is the love they know. It's what feels real. In the same way, someone who grew up in a home where love came with conditions may feel uncomfortable with unconditional affection. They might even sabotage it, because love without conditions doesn't fit the model the system learned. If you recognize yourself in any of this, there's a phrase that family constellation offers as a first gesture of recognition. You don't need to say it out loud. It can simply be an internal thought. I learned to love the way I learned. That was not my fault, and today I can learn a different way. This phrase doesn't resolve everything, but it begins to create distance between you and the pattern, which is already the first step toward no longer being governed by it. But there's something even deeper behind this, something Hellinger called invisible loyalties. And it may be determining your romantic choices without you having the slightest awareness of it. The invisible loyalties. This is one of the most powerful and least known to concepts in family constellation. Hellinger believed that we are deeply loyal to our family system, not in a conscious, deliberate way, but at a much deeper layer, a loyalty that operates like a silent law that nobody wrote, but everyone follows. These invisible loyalties shape our romantic choices in surprising ways. You may repeat your parents' relationship, even knowing it was dysfunctional. You may be attracted to someone who reproduces the emotional dynamic of an early attachment figure. You may unconsciously reject healthy relationships because they don't fit the model of love your system knows. The most common invisible loyalty is this. If one of your parents was unhappy in love, you may, without realizing it, feel that being happy in love is a form of abandonment, as if your happiness were a betrayal of their suffering. That seems irrational. And it is. But the family system doesn't operate by logic. It operates by love. And sometimes, the deepest love a child knows is the love that keeps them connected to their parents' suffering. There's also loyalty to failure. If a family carries a pattern of relationships that don't last, of betrayals, of abandonment, a descendant may unconsciously reproduce that pattern not out of weakness, but out of loyalty. As if lasting in love meant leaving the system behind, abandoning the ancestors. Recognizing these loyalties is not about blaming the family. It's about understanding that love can manifest in ways that imprison us. There's a phrase that family constellation uses to begin dissolving these invisible loyalties. You can say it internally, directed toward your parents or ancestors. I love you, and I leave your destiny with you. I stay with mine. This phrase serves a very specific function. It honors the bond without perpetuating the pattern. It says, I care about you, and at the same time, your suffering does not need to be mine. But what happens when two systems with different loyalties meet? Why do certain relationships carry an intensity that seems inexplicable from the very first encounters? Two systems meet. When you fall in love with someone, it's not just two people meeting. It's two entire family systems recognizing each other. Attraction frequently happens between people whose family systems carry complementary wounds. Not opposite, complementary. Like puzzle pieces that fit together perfectly, but that together reproduce exactly the pattern each one was already carrying alone. That's why certain relationships feel so intense from the very beginning. There's a deep recognition that goes beyond personality or appearance. The two systems recognize each other, and there's a feeling of having finally found someone who understands in a way that no one else does. That intensity is real, but it's not necessarily a sign of healthy compatibility. Sometimes it's a sign that two systems with similar wounds have found each other and will amplify those wounds in one another. That's why relationships that begin with overwhelming intensity frequently end with equally overwhelming pain. The intensity wasn't only love, it was also the weight of two systems trying, through the relationship, to resolve what was left unfinished in each family. If you're in a relationship like this right now, or if you're coming out of one, there's a reorganizing phrase that can help. What I feel for you is real, and part of what I feel also belongs to a story much older than ours. I'm learning to tell the two apart. This phrase doesn't diminish what you feel. It simply opens space to see more clearly where each part of that feeling is coming from. This already explains a great deal. But it still doesn't explain why certain specific people are impossible to forget, even years later. To understand that, you need to know one of the most disturbing concepts in family constellation: the excluded members. Hellinger observed that in every family there is someone who was excluded from the system: a child who died and was never mourned, a rejected relative whose name is no longer spoken, an abortion that was never acknowledged, an ancestor who did something shameful and was erased from collective memory. These excluded members, according to family constellation, don't disappear. They remain in the family field, and some descendant, without knowing it, begins to represent them, to carry the weight of what was never processed. How does this show up in attraction? You may feel drawn to people who unconsciously represent that excluded member in your system. There may be an inexplicable attraction to someone whose characteristics, life story, or emotional dynamic resonates with what went unacknowledged in your lineage. A concrete example: if in your family there's an ancestor who lived a forbidden love and was excluded because of it, you may repeatedly find yourself attracted to impossible relationships. Not because you want to complicate your life, but because you are unconsciously carrying that excluded person's story. And when the relationship ends, especially abruptly and painfully, there's a grief that seems disproportionate, because you're not only mourning the loss of that person, you're mourning everything they represented in your system's field. If you don't know who was excluded in your family, and many people don't, there's a general phrase that family constellation uses to honor the field as a whole. I honor all those who came before me, those who were acknowledged and those who were not. You belong to our family, and I carry only what is mine. You don't need to know the name. The system knows. And this honoring, even when done in internal silence, begins to reorganize the field. Now that you understand how excluded members operate, we need to talk about the invisible laws that govern every family system, and that, when violated, show up directly in your romantic choices. The orders of love. Hellinger developed the concept of the orders of love, invisible laws that govern family systems, and that, when disturbed, generate imbalances that manifest in subsequent generations. 3 orders are especially relevant for understanding attraction. The first is belonging. Every member of the system has the right to belong. When someone is excluded, the system seeks to restore that belonging through a descendant. In romantic relationships, this can manifest as a compulsive attraction to people who represent the excluded member, or as a tendency to exclude oneself from relationships before being excluded. The second is hierarchy. Those who came before have precedence over those who came after. When this order is inverted, when children take on parental roles, when a child becomes the emotional support for an adult, the system becomes destabilized, and that imbalance deeply affects how the person relates to care and dependency in adult relationships. The third is the balance between giving and receiving. In every healthy relationship, there is a flow of exchange. When that balance is chronically disturbed, the relationship loses vitality, and the person who always gives more than they receive is frequently repeating a pattern that goes back much further than that specific relationship. For someone who learned that love means giving without receiving, an available and reciprocal partner may seem boring or even suspicious. What hurts and is scarce feels more real than what nourishes and is present. When you sense that one of these orders may be disturbed in your system, there's a restoring phrase that family constellation proposes. I receive the love that is offered to me. I don't need to suffer to deserve it. I allow myself to be loved in a simple and real way. This phrase is especially powerful for those who struggle to receive, for those who sabotage healthy relationships or feel uncomfortable when someone is genuinely available. All of this may feel like a lot, but this is where family constellation becomes most powerful, because what it offers is not just diagnosis, it's a direction. So, What changes from here? Family constellation doesn't say you're condemned to repeat. It says you're repeating until you become aware. And awareness on its own already begins to shift the field. Hellinger had a phrase that summarizes everything. Love flows best when everyone is in their rightful place. When the members of the system are acknowledged, including those who were excluded, the energy that was locked in repetition begins to be released. And what was a compulsive attraction to painful patterns can, over time and within a work, transform into something different, the capacity to recognize and choose people who truly nourish. This doesn't happen overnight. The shift happens when the body, not just the mind, begins to recognize new patterns as safe. But the first step is always the same. See the pattern, name the repetition. Recognize that the attraction that feels so unique and so yours may have roots far older than your own story. You are part of a lineage. You carry stories you didn't choose to carry. That's not weakness, and it's the human condition. And to close, there's one final phrase, perhaps the most important of all. A phrase that family constellation reserves for the moment when someone finally decides to stop repeating and begin choosing. I honor my lineage. I am grateful for everything I received, the love and the pain. And from this moment on, I walk with my own destiny. This phrase doesn't erase the past. It places it where it belongs, behind you, sustaining you, not in front of you, blocking you. The greatest liberation is not to stop falling in love. It's to start falling in love more consciously. If you want more content like this, subscribe to the channel. See you next time.